8 of Britain's best, an elite SAS patrol, sent deep behind enemy lines. 3 would be killed, 4 captured and tortured, and 1 would make an impossible escape entirely on his own. This is what happens when an elite special forces team gets dropped behind enemy lines with faulty equipment, bad intelligence, and a plan that falls apart within hours. Today, we're going to tell you about Bravo 20, one of the most controversial SAS missions in history. But we're not here to repeat the heroic Hollywood version. We're going to look at what it really meant to be part of that 8-man patrol, what went wrong, and why 3 decades later the survivors still can't agree on what actually happened. On the night of January 23, 1991, 8 men from the British Special Air Service loaded into a helicopter bound for Iraq. Operation Desert Storm was in full swing. Coalition jets were pounding Iraqi positions, and Saddam Hussein was retaliating with Scud missiles aimed at Israel and Saudi Arabia. The air campaign couldn't stop the Scuds. The missiles were mounted on mobile launchers that kept moving, making them nearly impossible to hit from the air. So the coalition decided to do it the old-fashioned way: put men on the ground. Bravo 20 was one of several SAS patrols tasked with hunting Scuds in western Iraq. Their mission had 2 objectives. First, set up an observation post near a main supply route to track mobile launchers. Second, find and destroy a fiber optic cable running alongside the road. That cable linked Scud launchers to Iraqi command and control. Sever it, and you disrupt their ability to coordinate launches. The 8 men who made up Bravo 20 came from different backgrounds, but they were all SAS trained. Sergeant Andy McNab, a pseudonym he'd later use for his book, was the patrol commander. He'd been in the regiment for years. Chris Ryan, another pseudonym, was the patrol medic. Mike Coburn was a demolitions expert from New Zealand. There was Vince Phillips, a 20-year veteran. Dinger, a paratrooper with specialized training. Legs Lane, the communications expert. Bob Canelio, at 24, was the youngest. He'd been in the SAS just 6 months. And Stan, whose real name was Malcolm McGowan, completed the team. They geared up with everything they'd need for a 10-day mission. M16 rifles with grenade launchers, anti-tank weapons, belt kits packed with ammunition, heavy Bergens stuffed with food, water, and digging equipment. For communication, they had a short-burst radio to contact headquarters in Saudi Arabia, plus a tactical beacon for emergencies. For navigation, a GPS unit. On paper, they were ready. But there was one thing they didn't take: vehicles. McNab made that call. He declined suggestions from superior officers that the patrol bring Land Rovers. The argument was that vehicles would be too visible, too noisy. They'd move on foot, stay hidden, and rely on stealth. It was a decision that would come back to haunt them. The helicopter dropped them just over a mile from their target. Single file, weapons ready, they moved through the darkness toward the main supply route. An Allied bombing raid on a nearby airfield provided cover noise. By 4:45 a.m., they'd reached the MSR. That's when they hit their first problem. Instead of soft desert sand they could dig into, they found solid rock. Just a couple inches of sand on top of bedrock. Digging a proper observation post was impossible. McNab took a small group to scout for another hiding spot while the others stayed back to guard the gear. They found a shallow wadi, a dry riverbed. It wouldn't provide much cover, but with dawn approaching, it would have to do. As the sun came up, the temperature dropped. Iraq was having its worst winter in 30 years. The men hadn't been prepared for that. They huddled in the wadi, trying to stay warm. Then Legs Lane tried the radio. Nothing. The signal wasn't going through. In the rush to deploy, the radio had been encrypted with the wrong frequencies. It was useless. McNab wasn't too concerned. They had a contingency. If they failed to establish contact within 48 hours, a helicopter would arrive at a prearranged rendezvous point. They'd swap out the radio and continue the mission. For now, they still had a job to do: find the fiber optic cable. That night, McNab led a small recon patrol to search for it. Along the way, they spotted an Iraqi anti-aircraft position about 400 meters away. It was tempting to engage, but that wasn't the mission. They moved carefully around it. Near dawn, they found what they were looking for: white stakes stuck into the ground, presumably marking the cable. But first light was approaching fast. They'd have to come back the next night to destroy it. The next morning, the anti-aircraft crew they'd seen the night before drove to their position on the other side of the MSR. The Iraqis were close. maybe 400 meters away, but they didn't seem to be searching for anything. The patrol stayed hidden. Then they heard goats, lots of them, moving across the high ground above the wadi, and then a child's voice. Chris Ryan described what happened next. A young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, came over the edge and looked down into the wadi. He saw them. His eyes went wide. They tried to calm him, offered him chocolate. But he panicked, turned, and started running toward the Iraqi position, shouting as he went. The patrol had been compromised. They had minutes, maybe less. They dumped all non-essential gear, loaded up on water and ammunition, and prepared to move. The plan was to head south, back towards Saudi Arabia and the emergency RV point. But before they could clear the area, they heard vehicles approaching. Tank tracks, someone said. The SAS went into defensive positions, setting up anti-tank weapons. But it wasn't a tank, it was a bulldozer. The driver saw them and reversed. Then the shooting started. According to McNab's later account, the patrol engaged Iraqi soldiers and armored personnel carriers in a fierce firefight. They killed dozens of enemy troops and fought their way out under heavy fire. But other members of the patrol told different stories. Colin Armstrong, using the pseudonym Chris Ryan, said there was one armored car with a .50 caliber machine gun, though he never actually saw it himself. Mike Coburn wrote that there was at least one armored personnel carrier and heavy machine gun fire. Years later, a desert explorer and historian named Michael Asher investigated the incident. He interviewed the Bedouin family who discovered the patrol. According to them, they weren't sure who the men were and fired a few warning shots. The SAS returned fire and then withdrew. Asher concluded that the patrol had been challenged by a small group of lightly armed locals. There was no vicious firefight with Iraqi military units, as McNab had described, at least not then. Whatever happened, the patrol was now on the run. They headed for the emergency RV, but when they got there, the helicopter never showed up. The pilot had gotten ill mid-flight and aborted. The SAS were on their own. With no radio and no extraction, McNab made a command decision. They'd head northwest to Syria instead of south to Saudi Arabia. The Syrian border was about 110 miles away. 3 nights of hard walking. That night, as they moved across the desert, Allied aircraft passed overhead. McNab tried to signal them with the tactical beacon. A U.S. pilot heard the transmission but couldn't help. More aircraft were dispatched to the patrol's last known location, but visibility was poor, and they couldn't find anyone. The temperature kept dropping. The wind was brutal. Hypothermia became a real threat. Then things got worse. McNab stopped to try the beacon again. He told Vince Phillips to pass the word down the line that they were stopping. But Phillips, injured from the earlier contact and already showing signs of hypothermia, didn't pass the message. He kept walking. Stan and Chris Ryan followed him. By the time McNab turned around, 3 men were gone. The patrol had split in 2. McNab, Coburn, Legs, Dinger, and Bob were one group. Vince, Stan, and Chris Ryan were the other. Both groups knew the plan: head northwest to Syria. They'd just have to do it separately. Chris Ryan realized within an hour that they'd separated from the main group. He had a night sight and scanned the area behind them. Nothing. Just him, Vince, and Stan. 2 weapons between 3 men. Vince was in bad shape. His leg injury was slowing him down, and the cold was getting to him, but they kept moving. The Euphrates River was about 70 miles northwest. If they could reach it, they'd have water and a clear route to the border. Just before daybreak, they found an old tank berm and used it for cover. Iraqi vehicles were moving through the area, but they stayed hidden. The cold was unbearable. Chris Ryan had worked in some of the coldest places on Earth, and he'd later say that day was the longest of his life. They were freezing to death. When darkness came, they moved out again. Vince kept falling behind. He was going through the classic stages of hypothermia, shouting, confusion, wanting to lie down and sleep. Chris knew if Vince stopped, he'd die, but Vince couldn't keep up. At some point during the night, he vanished. Chris and Stan searched for 20 minutes, calling out into the darkness. Nothing. They had to keep moving. Vince Phillips died alone in the desert at age 36. His body was found later. Chris and Stan pushed on. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and running out of time. Near dawn, an Iraqi shepherd approached their position. Stan, desperate for a vehicle, convinced Chris that they should ask the shepherd for help. It was a terrible idea, but they were out of options. Stan insisted on going with the shepherd to find a tractor or car. He left his weapon and webbing with Chris. He said he'd be back by 6:30 p.m. Chris told him if he changed his mind, just shoot the shepherd and come back. Stan never returned. He walked with the shepherd for 4 hours until they came across a Toyota Land Cruiser with several men standing near it. According to some accounts, Stan shot an unarmed man as he ran toward the vehicle, then shot 2 more armed men before running out of ammunition. Vince Phillips hadn't reloaded his weapon since the firefight on January 24th. Stan was captured. McNab's book tells a different version. He wrote that the shepherd gave Stan directions to a hut near 2 vehicles. Stan was met with armed Iraqi soldiers, killed 1, engaged several more, and was captured when his gun jammed. In a 2002 interview, Stan partly confirmed his version, saying he came across a soldier, spoke to him in Arabic, and when the soldier made a move for the vehicle, Stan shot him in the head. Then more soldiers appeared, but he was already out of ammo. Michael Asher later interviewed the policeman who stopped Stan. According to Asher, there was no gunfight. The real story, he said, was much closer to Chris Ryan's second-hand account. But by then, the conflicting narratives were already established. Nobody could agree on what actually happened. Chris Ryan was now completely alone. He decided to stick with the plan, head northwest to Syria. For the next 7 days, he walked. No food for 7 days, no water for the last 3. At one point, he drank water from a chemical plant that was full of effluent. It burned his mouth, and he couldn't drink anything after that. He started hallucinating, seeing visions of his daughter so vivid that he reached out to touch her. After walking 186 miles over 7 nights, he finally reached the Syrian border town of Abu Kamal. He had cold injuries, had lost 38 pounds, had no toenails, and pus was coming out of blistered areas all over his body. He had bed sores and a damaged liver. But he was alive. He was taken to the British embassy in Syria and flown home. He's the one that got away. The title of the book he'd later write. Meanwhile, McNab's group of 5 was having their own nightmare. After the split, they kept moving northwest. On the night of January 27th, they came across a paved road. If they could hijack a vehicle, they could drive to the border. They waited hours in sub-zero temperatures. Finally, they saw headlights. A 1960s New York taxicab of all things. They flagged it down, forced the occupants out at gunpoint, and took off. They drove northwest, staying on roads that headed in the general direction of Syria. No clear route, just following whatever looked right. Eventually, they got caught in a line of traffic at a vehicle checkpoint. Iraqi soldiers were moving down the line, checking each vehicle. McNab and his men knew they were finished. They jumped out and ran. Bob Cornelio was shot and killed by armed civilians shortly after. He was 24 years old. The rest scattered. Legs, Lane, and Dinger ran for the Euphrates River. They made it to the bank and decided to swim for it. The half-mile swim in freezing water nearly killed them both. Legs collapsed on the far side. He couldn't go any farther. Dinger dragged him to an old farm shed and tried to keep him warm. A few minutes later, Iraqi soldiers approached the shed. Dinger made a run for it, trying to draw them away from Legs. Despite Dinger's sacrifice, Legs Lane died of hypothermia that night. He was 29. McNab and Mark were now the only 2 left from the original 5. They were low on ammunition and just 11 kilometers from the Syrian border. They could almost taste it, but Iraqi patrols were everywhere. As they moved toward the Euphrates, they were spotted. A firefight erupted. Mark was hit. McNab ran out of ammunition. He tried to escape in the darkness, but the next morning, Iraqi soldiers found him hiding in a drainage culvert under a road. He was just 1.5 miles from Syria. McNab, along with Dinger, Stan, and Mike Coburn, who'd all been captured separately, were taken to a military camp near Baghdad. Iraqi intelligence knew that British commandos had been operating in their rear. They'd counted casualties and believed the SAS had killed 250 of their soldiers. Now they wanted revenge. The torture and interrogation began immediately. McNab's training had prepared him for this, but it was brutal. The Iraqis wanted to know everything. Mission objectives, unit strength, future operations. McNab and the others tried to resist, giving minimal information, sticking to cover stories. They were medics, separated from their unit. The Iraqis didn't believe them. McNab later wrote about extreme torture, teeth pulling, burning. But Stan McGowan would later clarify that such incidents did not happen. He said it was inconceivable that anything like that could have occurred without being discussed or being physically obvious. The details of what they endured remain disputed to this day. The cells were filthy and freezing. Beatings came regularly. After 8 days, McNab decided his men had held out long enough. He told his interrogators a modified version of the truth. They were part of a close observation patrol. Much of the information he gave them, they already knew or could verify. It helped establish credibility. On February 26, 1991, Saddam Hussein agreed to withdraw from Kuwait. The war was over. 10 days later, the captured SAS commandos were released. At the Red Cross station in Baghdad, McNab was surprised to find Mark alive. He'd only been wounded in the final firefight, not killed. 5 members of Bravo 20 survived. 3 did not. The mission had been a disaster. 3 men dead. 4 captured and tortured. 0 Scud launchers destroyed. The fiber optic cable was never cut. And yet, when the surviving members returned home, the story started to change. In 1993, Andy McNab published Bravo 20, a book about the mission. It became a bestseller. He described fierce firefights with Iraqi troops, heroic last stands, and estimated the patrol had killed 250 enemy soldiers. But that number has been questioned ever since. Where did it come from? McNab never mentioned it in any of his debriefs immediately after the mission. Critics, including former SAS officer Peter Ratcliffe, have called the claim absurd. In 1995, Chris Ryan published The One That Got Away, his own account of the mission. It contradicted McNab's version in several key areas: the distance they walked after insertion, the nature of the initial contact, the actions of individual patrol members. Ryan also vilified Vince Phillips, suggesting he'd compromised the patrol by not killing the shepherd and then gave up during the escape. That criticism stung. Phillips was dead and couldn't defend himself. Mike Coburn, the New Zealand-born demolitions expert, tried to publish his own book in 2004. But the British government fought him for 5 years, spending an estimated £7 million of taxpayer money to stop publication. They claimed he'd breached a confidentiality contract signed in 1996. Coburn argued that he and his teammates had been ordered to sign those papers after McNab and Ryan's books came out, and that the story was already in the public domain. How could it be confidential? Eventually, Coburn won the right to publish Soldier 5, his account of the mission. But the Ministry of Defense seized the profits. Coburn had planned to share the money with the families of the deceased and the other survivors. Instead, he got nothing. He said he'd been treated worse by the British government than the Iraqis had treated him in prison. Coburn's book was different from the others. It was straightforward, with none of the heroics McNab and Ryan had included. He laid much of the blame on poor leadership decisions and bad intelligence. The patrol had been dropped into an area with 3,000 Iraqi soldiers, given broken radio equipment, no vehicles, and a bad escape route. He said superior officers had treated the patrol as expendable. When a call came in for extraction, those officers dismissed it as premature. That decision, he believed, cost 3 men their lives. Michael Asher, the desert explorer who investigated the mission years later, interviewed Iraqi civilians and police officers who'd been involved. His findings contradicted much of what McNab and Ryan had written. There were no massive firefights with Iraqi military units. The patrol hadn't killed 250 soldiers. The heroic narratives, he concluded, were exaggerations at best. Peter Ratcliffe, a former SAS officer and Gulf War veteran, was even harsher. He blamed McNab for the faulty radio equipment, pointing out that as patrol commander, it was his job to ensure everything worked before insertion. He criticized the decision not to take vehicles, which would have made escape much easier, and he called the use of real names in the books insensitive, noting that McNab and Ryan hid behind pseudonyms while exposing their dead colleagues. The controversy never ended. The survivors couldn't agree on what happened. The government tried to suppress alternative accounts, and the families of the dead were left wondering which version, if any, was true. For the men who survived, the mission left deep scars. Chris Ryan walked 186 miles through enemy territory and made it home. He's not bitter about what he endured. He told an interviewer that it's war, the confusion of war. Mistakes were made, but the regiment tries to learn from them. there wouldn't be any more young men having to walk 7 days and 8 nights. You've got to take the positive side. Mike Coburn, after years of legal battles with his own government, became jaded. He said the experience taught him that the Special Air Service, for all its elite training and reputation, was still part of a military bureaucracy that sometimes failed its own soldiers. The attitude of senior officers, treating the patrol as expendable, was unacceptable. If you're going to put people in harm's way, he said, you have a duty to do your utmost to get them back. And if you're not, you've got to tell them. Andy McNab went on to have a lucrative career as an author, writing fiction and nonfiction about the SAS and military operations. His books sold millions of copies. But the questions about Bravo 20 never went away. Critics pointed out inconsistencies, challenged his claims, and accused him of embellishing the truth for commercial gain. The British Ministry of Defense never released a full official account of the mission. What's in the public domain comes from the survivors, and they all tell different stories. The mission report, if it exists, remains classified. The families of Vince Phillips, Bob Coniglio, and Legs Lane have been left to piece together what happened from conflicting narratives. In the end, Bravo 20 became one of the most controversial SAS missions in history, not because of what happened in the desert, but because of what happened afterward. The books, the lawsuits, the conflicting accounts, and the government's attempts to control the narrative turned a tragic military failure into a public spectacle. 3 men died on that mission. Bob Coniglio, shot by civilians at a checkpoint. Legs Lane, dead from hypothermia in a farm shed. Vince Phillips, lost in the darkness, alone and freezing. Their sacrifices are undeniable, but the circumstances of their deaths, the decisions that led to them, and the way their stories have been told remain in dispute 3 decades later. For anyone trying to understand what really happened, the truth is buried somewhere between the heroic version, the critical version, and the suppressed version. The desert keeps its secrets, and the men who walked through it can't agree on what they saw.